بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين. السادة الحضور، نرحب بكم في هذه الأمسية والندوة العلمية من ندوات أكاديمية نسيج، والتي سأحرص رغم أنها حول موضوع سيطرح باللغة الإنجليزية وسيكون هناك ترجمة فورية باللغة العربية لها. سأحرص على أن أبدأها باللغة العربية لخصوصيات الموضوع وبعض النقاش الذي أثير حول المقابل العربي لها. فأرحب بكم أولا وأنوه على أن هذه الندوة برعاية المداد، وأن هذه الندوة مترجمة إلى اللغة العربية، فيمكن لحضورنا الذين يرغبون في سماعها باللغة العربية أن يضغطوا على الرمز الخاص بالكرة الأرضية لاختيار اللغة، ويقينا من يريد أن يسمعها باللغة الإنجليزية سيكون معنا المتحدثة باللغة الإنجليزية. أيضا أنوه على أن الأسئلة يفضل أن تكتب في صندوق الأسئلة والاستفسارات question and answer، وسيتم الإجابة عنها في نهاية الندوة بإذن الله. ندوتنا اليوم حول ما نطلق عليه الأرشيف والتوعية الخاصة بالجوانب المختلفة للأبعاد الرقمية، أو ما أردنا أن نبسطه ونقول الأرشيف والمنح الدراسية الرقمية أو الأرشيف والتوعية الرقمية. كل هذه المقابلات العربية تسعى إلى التركيز على موضوع هو كيف نفتح المجال للتقنيات والأساليب التي تساعدنا في المساحات الرقمية وعلاقتها بالأرشيف. وبالتالي سوف نتحدث عن التحديات والفرص التي يمكن استغلالها في هذا الجانب. وبالتالي في هذه الندوة سوف يتم مناقشة التوجهات الحالية والرؤى المستقبلية الخاصة بالتوعية الرقمية أو المنح إنجاز التعبير في مجال الأرشيف، وكيف يتم التعاطي معها وتلبية الاحتياجات المرتبطة بها. كذلك سيتم الحديث عن توصيف الأساليب والأدوات المرتبطة بالحاسب الآلي والميكنة أو التحسين أو الأتمتة كيفما تشاءون المقابل العربي لها، التي يتم تطبيقها في مجال الأرشيف والمحاذير التي تكتنف عملية التطبيق هذه. كذلك سوف يتم استعراض بعض الدروس المستفادة من المشاريع المختلفة في هذا المجال والمنهجيات التي استخدمت في التطبيق، ثم سوف يعرج في الأخير من قبل المتحدثة على بعض الأدبيات حول هذا الموضوع والمشاريع المرتبطة بها. ضيفتنا المتحدثة في هذه الليلة ليست غريبة، لقد استضيفت من قبل في إحدى الندوات سابقا، وهي البروفيسورة بيثاني أندرسون، الأستاذة المساعدة ومسؤولة في الأرشيف في العلوم الطبيعية والتطبيقية بجامعة إلينوي Urbana-Champaign، وهي الأولى حتى الآن في عام 2022 في برامج المكتبات والمعلومات في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، وهي رئيسة تحرير مشاركة لدورية هما المجلة الدورية للأرشيف، ومحررة مشاركة لدورية مستقبل الأرشيف Archival Futures، مستقبليات الأرشيف المستقبليات الأرشيفية، وهي سلسلة تصدر بالشراكة بين جمعية الأرشيفيين الأمريكيين وجمعية المكتبات الأمريكية ALA، كما أنها مهتمة بالأرشيفات العلمية وأساليب الأتمتة الأرشيفات. I'm just giving not brief but a little bit long introduction, Bethany, for you and for your topic, which is a little bit we face some challenges to convert or transform it to the Arabic concept, not the literally word. So that's pushed me to start with a different way, just to start in Arabic at general, but I will not let this chance to go without it. Thank you so much for being with us again, and we are looking always for having you in similar webinars. I introduce you in Arabic, so I will give you the virtual stage and the virtual microphone to introduce yourself in the way that you like in English, and I confirm that all the questions will be received at the end of the webinar written in the Q&A box. So the floor is yours. Please start your webinar, Bethany.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Abdallah and Mr. Saeed, and thank you to the Naseej Academy for the invitation to speak with you all today. And thank you all so much for attending and engaging with me in this topic. As Dr. Abdallah may have mentioned, I am Bethany Anderson, and I am a science archivist at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the USA. Today, I will be talking about the relationship between digital scholarship and archives, and I will be discussing a case study from my own work. Please feel free to add questions in the chat as I'm talking, and I believe we will have some time for questions at the end of the presentation. But I also hope we have the opportunity for discussion to learn more about how you may be engaging with digital scholarship and working with archives, or both. So to share a bit about myself, as I mentioned, I'm a science archivist and I work in the University of Illinois Archives, where I manage records of scientific units and laboratories at the University of Illinois. I have a dual role as both an archivist and a professor, and thus I have a research component to my job. My research focuses on several areas, but chiefly on how to manage and enhance access to scientific archives. I'm also interested in computational approaches to digital archives and creating a diverse and inclusive historical record of science. I am looking forward to sharing some of my research with you and learning from your perspectives on this topic. So to get started, I will be talking about the relationship between archives and digital scholarship with the following objectives: to define digital scholarship roughly, describe digital scholarship's relationship to archives, describe opportunities for engaging with digital scholarship in an archival context, describe some of the challenges for applying computational methods and tools to archives, and discuss lessons learned based on a case study for a project that I worked on. While my role is as an archivist and experience has been mostly working with archives, I do want to emphasize that colleagues from libraries, information science, and allied professions in general are most welcome in this discussion. So you do not need to be an archivist to participate in this webinar. Stewarding and preserving archives is something that we all have a vested interest in, and as a result, discussion and scholarship about archives by necessity should create dialogues between different professions across the world. So to begin with a definition, what is digital scholarship? According to a colleague from my own institution, the University of Illinois, digital scholarship is an all-encompassing term and it can be used very broadly. Digital scholarship refers to the use of digital tools, methods, evidence, or any other digital materials to complete a scholarly project. It is a very broad and flexible term that includes methods, materials, and tools. Another definition, which I did not put on this slide, but I did want to mention briefly, comes from the University of Washington and is invoked in a recent report by the Library of Congress in the USA on digital scholarship services. The University of Washington's libraries notes that, quote, digital scholarship is defined as any scholarly activity that makes extensive use of one or more of the new possibilities for teaching and research, opened up by the unique affordances of digital media. Digital scholarship is thus essentially a range of activities that occur in a digital context. However, it is important to note that just because you are using a digital tool or software means that you are engaging in digital scholarship. For example, writing an essay in a Microsoft Word document is not the same as digital scholarship. But if one uses specialized software to collect or generate data, or analyze some sort of evidence, or use digital platforms for disseminating the research results, that would be more akin to digital scholarship. While I'm not going to discuss this in a great deal of depth, I think it is worth briefly noting that there are several related and overlapping terms that you might come across with respect to digital scholarship. Perhaps one term that is most related to digital scholarship is digital humanities, which is generally described as an academic field of study. According to Matthew Kirschenbaum, who is a professor of English and Digital Studies at the University of Maryland, in his article titled, "What is Digital Humanities and What's It Doing in English Departments?" he notes that, quote, "Digital humanities is more akin to a common methodological outlook than an investment in any one specific set of texts or methodologies," end quote. Digital history is another related term, but it has more of a disciplinary focus on history. But it is, again, not about the use of any one tool or methodology, but a range of activities and engagements with digital materials and tools to explore historical questions. The last three terms on this slide are not so much overlapping terms with digital scholarship, but tools or approaches that you might come across in this space or in these discussions. Computational as a term refers to the use of computers. The University of Maryland College of Information Studies has a computational archival science program, which is a prime example of the ways in which archivists are employing computational methods to explore and interrogate archival theory and digital archives. And lastly, artificial intelligence and machine learning are talked about in this space. Artificial intelligence, or AI, is thought to be simulation by computer programs or activity considered intelligent. Whereas according to John Kelleher and Brendan Tierney in their book, Data Science, machine learning, quote, develops the algorithms that computers follow in order to identify and extract patterns from data. Sometimes these two terms tend to be used interchangeably. It is worth noting that all of these terms' meanings have evolved and will continue to evolve as we continue to use and engage with these wide-ranging methods, activities, tools, and orientations towards digital content. As a broad concept, digital scholarship can result in a wide variety of outputs and engagements. These could include visualizations of data, 3D modeling and printing, text analyses, digital publishing, such as a digital edition of a text, GIS, and digital mapping projects, and text markup, such as TEI encoding. And for those of you who may not be familiar with TEI, it stands for the Text Encoding Initiative, which is an XML format for marking up text. These are only a few examples of some of the outputs and engagements of digital scholarship. In addition to having a range of outputs, digital scholarship also has a range of uses or ways that it can be useful. These include being able to take a large amount of data or creating or generating data from some source and analyzing it. Many people might do this to find some sort of latent pattern or relationship between data. It can also be used to facilitate engagement with materials in an online space, like on a website or a digital project online, and encourage reuse of that content or data in some instances. From an archival perspective, the recent phenomenon of creating archives as data, which also might be referred to as collections as data, or the process of datafying archives, seeks to transform digital archival materials, or digital archives, into data to be analyzed through computational methods. This, quote, datafication of archives, end quote, is useful for both archivists and researchers. Archivists are managing an increasingly large corpus of digitized and born digital materials. And so such approaches appear to be for appraising, arranging, and describing archival materials. Michael Moss, David Thomas, and Tim Gollins recently published an article in Archivaria, which is a journal published by the Association of Canadian Archivists. And in the article, they argue that the large quantity of digital archival materials makes a close reading of those records very difficult. and thus archivists should consider adopting a macroscopic approach using computational means. But using computational approaches is not necessarily easy to do. Recent examples of using these technologies to datafy or create datafy archives indicate their usefulness, but also the amount of resources and staff time to make that happen. Not to mention technological infrastructure and general administrative support for this work. So what does it mean to datafy archives or create archives as data? There are a range of considerations. If the material is not already born digital, it will need to be digitized. However, it is generally not enough to just digitize material, but to ensure that the contents of the digitized archival materials can be parsed by a computer. Optical character recognition, or OCR as it's called, can be useful for this. However, OCR is not always accurate and might require some cleanup. If the materials are handwritten, they may need to be transcribed. Although I have heard of advances in using artificial intelligence technologies to automatically transcribe handwritten material. Depending on the purpose for which the digital materials will be used, they will need to be machine readable, either through a structured format like a CSV file or through text markup. If archival repositories are wanting to create access to their records, there are also a host of considerations for making their collections machine ready, in a sense, making available data from the records in a way that can be easily used by researchers. Some of these considerations entail making the data and the records from which the data are extracted available for bulk download, ensuring sufficient metadata exists so that researchers can find and understand the nature of the data. Think about what can be made openly available based on legal and ethical issues that might be present in the data, and document the process by which the repository creates the data and make that process openly transparent to researchers. Some of these considerations can be drawn from the field of research data management itself, but also from archival practice. I highly recommend reading the Library of Congress's recent report on digital scholarship services for further guidance on this matter. And there is a link to that report on the slide, and it is also on a list of resources that I note at the end of this presentation. Datafying archives or creating archives as data enables one to take a macroscopic view of materials and can answer questions about what kinds of patterns exist and what broadly do the materials document in terms of subjects. I mentioned earlier an article by Michael Moss, David Thomas, and Tim Gollins, who argue in their Archivaria article published in 2018 titled "The Reconfiguration of the Archive as Data to be Mined," that archivists need a way to appraise this large amount of material, as well as the emerging needs of historians and other researchers to engage with large quantities of archival material. They also argue that the future of archival collections is as data, and we need to rethink how we quote unquote read or engage with records. This is one, but not the only way that engaging with archives in a digital scholarship framework can be useful. Before moving on to a case study based on my own work, I do want to mention an important challenge to recognize and be aware of when making archives as data. And this has to do with the loss of context. As archivists and archival repositories and even researchers work with data generated from digital archives, it is important to ensure the original provenance and context of the data is tracked and documented. A relevant and interesting article on this tendency with archival materials to be decontextualized is an article by Emily Monks-Leeson, which was published in 2011 in the journal American Archivist, which is titled "Archives on the Internet: representing context and provenance from repository to website. Monks-Leeson notes that digital projects may have a tendency to decontextualize archival materials as they are regrouped and reorganized according to different subjects or topics. It is important to ensure this doesn't happen and that the original context is documented and attached to the data, such as through metadata. Okay, so now having provided this background, I am now going to discuss a case study based on my own work that I did with several colleagues that explored making archival materials available in a digital scholarship framework and used computational methods and tools. The project was titled the Cybernetics Thought Collective, a History of Science and Technology Portal Project, and was a pilot initiative funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is an independent federal agency in the United States. This project was a collaborative endeavor between the University of Illinois Archives, where I work, as well as with the American Philosophical Society, the British Library, and MIT. And the project sought to use machine learning and natural language processing tools to enable researchers to explore cybernetics, a transdisciplinary scientific movement, and its thought collective, as reflected primarily in the correspondence, publications, and other records, this network of scholars who were connected through mutual personal and intellectual bonds. Since this was an experimental pilot project, we included 4 sets of personal papers or personal archives of founding members of cybernetics. This included Heinz von Forster, a physicist whose papers are held by the University of Illinois, Warren McCullough, a neurophysiologist whose papers are held by the American Philosophical Society, W. Ross Ashby, a psychiatrist whose papers are held by the British Library, and Norbert Wiener, a mathematician whose papers are held at MIT. In this project, we sought to experiment with technologies to create machine-generated data from primarily the correspondence of these scientists and provide access to the data in 3 distinct but interrelated ways. First, as archival metadata for the digitized records. Secondly, as reusable data to facilitate other digital scholarly analyses. And thirdly, as the basis for a series of test visualizations of the data to explore this scientific network. There were a few reasons why we explored creating this data to be used and repurposed in these specific ways. Computational methods and tools like machine learning and natural language processing have been and are being explored by the archival community to complete tasks that would be difficult otherwise, as I mentioned earlier. And they have been used for such activities as appraisal and determining what records have value and that kind of thing, and conducting sensitivity reviews, so to find and identify content within digital archival materials that might be sensitive or have confidential information. But they've also been used for generating data to be used as metadata to describe these materials. On the other hand, computational methods are being used to facilitate archival access in an archives as data vein, which enables archives to be accessed programmatically through APIs and allow the analysis of digital records to be integrated into software pipelines. In response to this trend, the library and archival professions are exploring digital scholarship frameworks that meet the evolving needs of researchers to access and analyze large quantities of archival data. These tools also raise new research questions and suggest possible enhancements to the ways that archivists have traditionally practiced their craft. For me especially, I was interested in seeing how we could use these tools to create access to scientific correspondence networks and explore in particular the network as a sort of provenance for these materials. These scientists, or as they actually more properly called cyberneticians, formed a network that corresponded frequently and in ways that led to a dispersed archival record. In particular, the personal archives of cyberneticians seem to especially lend themselves to computational methods and tools, given that cybernetics has a distinct vocabulary and a set of core concepts. Likewise, the distributed nature of these archives reflects an expansive network of communication that could be mapped to network analysis interfaces. And in a recursive sense, these same cyberneticians' work anticipated some of the very same technologies that we ended up using on their materials, on their archival materials. So it ended up being a very cybernetics of cybernetics project, if you will, which I think these cyberneticians would have approved of. But it's important to talk about the history of cybernetics briefly to elaborate on why these methods were selected and why we used the particular framework that we did. There are two events largely responsible for the emergence of cybernetics as a scientific movement. One is the publication of Cybernetics or Control and Communication in the Animal and Machine, which was published in 1948 by Norbert Wiener. The other is a series of conferences between 1946 and 1953, hosted by the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, and were mostly held in New York City. They were known as by their very long title of the Macy Conferences on Circular, Causal, and Feedback Mechanisms in Biological and Social Systems. And thankfully, this was shortened later on, and they just referred to it as the Macy Conferences on Cybernetics. The meetings initially sought to explore questions about behavior and information feedback for both organisms and machines. The conferences drew participants from a wide variety of disciplinary perspectives, including information theory, philosophy, anthropology, psychiatry, physics, and neurophysiology, among others. Some of the participants included anthropologists Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, physiologist Arturo Rosenblueth, and information theorist Claude Shannon, and many others, as well as the 4 individuals whose archives were the subject of this grant project. Fundamentally, cybernetics was a transdisciplinary scientific movement that explored the possibilities of machines and computing, and what those possibilities said about the human condition. Cybernetic research led to experimental approaches for bionics and thinking machines. Though many definitions for cybernetics exist, it is most clearly defined as the study of communication and control, or as the study of behavior. Given its broadness and the blurriness of its disciplinary boundaries, cybernetics has come to mean many different things to many different people. Research in cybernetics initially sought to develop automated defense mechanisms in light of the big science that characterized the post-World War II era, but it evolved for different uses and meanings over time. For example, during the 1960s and 1970s, what became known as second-order cybernetics in part fostered the development of utopian and counterculture notions about the role of technology in society and its relationship to human beings. For example, Stuart Brand, who created the Whole Earth Catalog, drew from cybernetic concepts amid new social currents. As another example, the notion of autopoiesis, or the ability for a cell, this is in biology, for a cell to self-reproduce and regulate itself, was developed by biologists Umberto Maturana, Francisco Varela, and Ricardo Uribe, who are also cyberneticians. Cybernetics has also been credited as having led to the development of artificial intelligence itself, though the relationship between the two has been debated. At the same time, the development of cybernetics has been influenced by other disciplines itself. For example, one can see the influence anthropology, and especially that Margaret Mead, had on second-order cybernetics and the idea of applying cybernetic principles to itself to study its own discipline. Given its broadness and fluid disciplinary boundaries, cybernetics has been both called the new science and the universal science. And it is important to note too that it spread broadly across the United States, Europe, South America, and what was then called the Soviet Union, where it was applied in different social and political contexts. Cybernetics emerged from the Macy conferences as an international scientific movement composed of an extensive network of scientists. In addition to establishing centers for cybernetics research at institutions like the University of Illinois and MIT, it also created a correspondence network, which in part was sustained and supported the exchange and development of its ideas. One day when I was looking through Heinz von Forster's papers, I came across this document in which a former student of his named Paul Schrader had written that, quote, "Cybernetics is a whole collection of concepts supported by a whole collection of people." And I felt that this quote was really apt, and it really resonated with me. And it made me realize that the ways in which this notion of the collective, of collectivity, of the collective group was so central to the creation and advancement of cybernetics' main concepts, but also arguably the provenance of the materials themselves. This led me and my colleagues to the concept of the thought collective. One of the hallmarks of modern contemporary science, including 20th and 21st century science, is its collaborative and sometimes global nature. Scientific research is often characterized by networks of colleagues working together and exchanging and debating ideas. However, the practice of exchanging scientific ideas and sharing data and drafts of publications through correspondence goes back to at least the early modern period in Europe, which historian of science Elizabeth Yale explores in her recent publication, Sociable Knowledge. Microbiologist Ludwig Fleck describes this phenomenon of social and intellectual interaction in science as a, quote, thought collective, as he says, a community of persons mutually exchanging ideas or maintaining intellectual interaction. From an archival perspective, it is a thought collective within its particular social, political, and intellectual context that exchanges correspondence, shares data, and circulates drafts of publications to create and contest scientific data and ideas. Within the archival and information studies literature, developing ways to create access to correspondence networks has received some attention. In David Cronick's article from the early 2000s titled "The Commerce of Letters," Cronick uses what is an analogous term to thought collective in the context of correspondence networks, describing what he calls invisible colleges, which were composed of scholars who shared ideas through letters. Cronick speculated as to whether computer software, as he called, could be used for analysis of invisible colleges through correspondence, undertaking a similar approach that had been used for co-citation studies, which seems to anticipate later digital scholarship to reveal correspondence networks. Recent initiatives, such as Mapping the Republic of Letters, I think which is at University of Cambridge, And Mapping the Republic of Letters is at Stanford University, apologies. And the Epsilon project focused on Charles Darwin's correspondence network at Cambridge are part of a shift to reveal connections among people and their letters. Historian of science Brian Ogilvie writes that, quote, correspondence has created and sustained national and international communities of scientists, transmitting ideas and material while sustaining effective bonds or emotional bonds between collaborators in the scientific enterprise, situated between the immediacy of conversation and the finality of publication, and has served an important, if changing, role in the creation of knowledge. Ogilvie also notes that correspondence networks have, quote, recently become distinct objects of historical inquiry in themselves. For projects focused on early modern scientific networks, he writes, digital correspondence projects allow us to establish a clearer cartography of the space of flows of science. They will allow scholars to dig more deeply into how correspondence helped individual scientists, or small groups to better coordinate observations, exchange information, and debate interpretations. All of this underscores the importance of correspondence or letters to the development of science and the making of the correspondence networks accessible for broad study. To create correspondence networks, you need metadata or data. One thing that we were particularly interested in exploring in this project is the extent to which we could use machine-generated data from the archives of these cyberneticians as the basis of the network, but certainly not to take place of all the metadata that we would use. And one thing I want to emphasize is that even though I refer to this as machine-generated metadata and draw a distinction with human-created metadata, I think it is important to note this is a tenuous distinction and that it can obscure the human agency and subjectivity that is ingrained in these tools and methods. Archivist Devin Mordell recently published an article in Archivaria in which, among their important takeaways, they caution against viewing archival data produced through computational processes as somehow objective and neutral. So it's important to establish this, and that the machine or the tool that you're using is not necessarily objective, neutral, or an autonomous agent. We wanted to generate data to be used as metadata from the records to see what the records could tell us themselves, in a sense, and give us insight into how they are connected, if at all, to other records across other personal archives. We needed the assistance of tools to help us do that. Artificial intelligence, or AI, machine learning, and natural language processing have evolving definitions, as I noted before, largely due to the evolving nature of technologies and their capabilities. But in general, AI, or artificial intelligence, is thought to be simulation by computer programs or of activity considered intelligent. Machine learning, as I mentioned earlier, develops the algorithms that computers follow in order to identify and extract patterns from data. Natural language processing, or for short NLP, bears similarity to machine learning, but is generally deployed to understand natural language in spoken and written form to, quote, extract a fuller meaning representation from free text. And I want to note that these definitions are drawn from John D. Kelleher and Brendan Tierney, as well as works by Ann Cow and Stephen R. Poteet. And I'm happy to provide citations for that later as well. To use these tools to generate data and to see how the materials across these personal archives connect in a preliminary sense, specifically connected to the exchange of cybernetic concepts and ideas, there were a series of steps that we took. It was not a neat or linear process by any means, since some of the steps were done concurrent with each other, or we went and revisited some steps after testing new machine learning and natural language processing tools that worked better. So that's why I represent the process as sort of not a straight line here on this slide. But the first steps were to digitize the materials, process them through optical character recognition, or OCR, and then to try to clean up or remediate errors resulting from OCR, which, as I mentioned, does, depending upon the tool that you're using, it might produce some messy results. And then we also tried to reduce what we call noise in the text. So this entailed removing prepositions and words to help us get more at some of the words that align more with specific concepts, such as autopoiesis or biology and that kind of thing. And so we did all of this in general to prepare the materials for analysis in a computational pipeline that I will talk about in a little bit more depth shortly. In addition to all of this, the team needed a vocabulary with which to train the algorithm in the machine learning and natural language processing tools in order to analyze the documents. In other words, generate cybernetic data from the materials and classify the documents into broad categories related to cybernetics. Cybernetics has a distinct set of concepts and related vocabulary, as I mentioned earlier, which we sought to use as the basis for identifying entities or data within these materials. To attempt to shed light on the thought collective of cybernetics, it was important to decide how cybernetic concepts and ideas would be recognizable in order to reveal how they were formed and exchanged. One way to do this is to identify cybernetic terms associated with many of its main concepts. But larger challenges concerning semantics and linguistic properties of the text could not be ignored, especially identifying terms for the same concept that evolved and changed over time. And that is something that we hope to address at a later phase of this project. We needed an authoritative list of these terms and concepts that existed at the time that these cyberneticians were active and corresponding with each other. We selected the publication, which you see the front page of on this slide, which is titled Cybernetics of Cybernetics, or The Control of Control and the Communication of Communication, which is a comprehensive collection of essays on cybernetics. Before we hired any computer programmers, we uploaded a digital version of this publication to a tool called Voyant Tools, which is an open source sort of digital humanities tool that you can find and use for your own purposes. But we used this tool to generate an initial list based on word frequencies. The terms with the highest occurrences were organized into several categories. The team on this grant project also consulted with several cybernetic glossaries that exist out there and shared the list with our advisory board for feedback. As we later realized, many of the terms from the list turned out to be present in the records. So this list did indeed anticipate some of the data that was machine generated from the archival materials. However, we still question what cybernetic terms might have been missed or whether any of these terms were false positives. In the future, investigating other ways to identify entities should be explored in order to perform quality control and verify the reliability of these results. Using the cybernetic vocabulary as inputs, we experimented with a number of Python libraries for natural language processing and named entity extraction. A list of cybernetic terms were created for each folder level of the materials. Following entity identification, the project team decided to adopt what is called a supervised machine learning approach to classify the records into 4 broad categories. And these 4 broad categories included mathematics or logic, computers and machines, psychology and neuroscience, and then a category that we called personal because there was some correspondence in which these cyberneticians were talking about their families or their personal life and not about science specifically. We use software called Naive Bayes and Weka for the machine learning portion of the project. And I should note that while we had developed some mechanisms for performing quality control on the results and assessing the reliability of those results, the machine learning output was not always consistent. And we realized that that may have to do with both the size of the training set that we had prepared, as well as the variations in document length, which is typical of archival materials. But the machine learning algorithms seemed to work better on aggregations of material that were about no longer than 8 to 10 pages in length. So that is something we would have to address at a later stage to get more reliable results. We also sought to provide some algorithmic transparency, as it were, by indicating the percentages of certainty about the machine learning results. But these preliminary results might indicate deeper nuances in the materials, which is unsurprising given the range of topics that someone might write about in a letter. These percentages of certainty were made available through the metadata profile for each folder of correspondence in the University of Illinois Digital Library, where all the materials and data have been made accessible. And I'm happy to share a link to that in the chat later on as well. After testing various software, we solidified a Python-based pipeline. Following this pipeline, we imported text from the PDF files into plain text format. We addressed any errors and tried to reduce the what we call the noise in the files, which is, again, removing words like prepositions and so forth to kind of clean it up and get at those kind of core words that are part of the text. Then we generated the entities or the output from this after using the natural language processing and machine learning tools. We classified the documents into the 4 categories that I mentioned. And then we estimated the percentage of certainty for each category per folder, basically, of material. The pipeline is documented in the project's GitHub repository, and all of the data resulting from the output or entity extraction and machine learning steps were imported into CSV files that have been made available for research use and used as partial metadata for the digital collection that is available for researchers to use. So this was sort of a brief run through of a very complicated process, but I wanted to get back to the goals of this project and the outputs of this process. As I mentioned toward the beginning, we sought to create machine generated data from primarily the correspondence of these cyberneticians and provide access in 3 distinct but interrelated ways. As archival metadata for the digitized records, which you can see on the left on the slide, as reusable data to facilitate digital scholarly analyses, which is at the bottom right on the slide, and as the basis for a series of test visualizations of the data to explore this network. And you can see one of the a screenshot of one of the visualizations at the top right of that slide. To use this data as metadata, we adapted our metadata profile, or basically the description profile in our digital collections portal for archival materials to include fields for what we call machine-generated metadata. So it is clear what was produced as part of the project and what's, sort of human-created metadata. In the same place, we created access to all of the data, which is available as a CSV file, along with a README note that briefly explains the process and the metadata fields. And lastly, we tested several different visualization software for displaying this data. We honestly had a lot of trouble finding a visualization tool that would work well, especially because displaying all that data would look extremely messy given the amount of data that we had. So we ended up using a sample of this data for the visualizations. It was also really important to make clear in the visualization how the data themselves connected back to the original digitized materials or digital surrogates. And we had some success using a tool called Anodo so that it's clear, what the original context is for the data, as well as to enable some more interactivity with the data. And if you're interested in taking a look at the data and the digital surrogates, the link to the digital collection is at the bottom of this slide. And again, I can put that link in the chat. So going back to what I mentioned at the very beginning about how provenance and the context of materials can get lost in projects like these. So computational archives and digital projects raise a number of questions about how to represent and respect the provenance of archival materials. So how they were created, where they were created, and that kind of thing. For cybernetics, the exchange of ideas and the formation and interrogation of concepts is important for understanding it and why cybernetics developed in the way that it did. How do we represent that in a way that respects the context of creation and the provenance for those ideas and the records in which they are documented? Can computational methods enable us to capture and convey that provenance in ways that we wouldn't at least easily be able to do otherwise? These are open questions that we still don't have answers to. Revealing links between records across personal archives lead to explorations of the community as provenance, or in this case, the community or collective of cyberneticians who articulated and refined their ideas for these records. Archival scholars Jeanette Bastian, Terry Cook, and Brian Brothman, among others, have broadened our understandings of provenance to extend beyond a single creator who may have written a letter or created a diary, for example. And they've broadened that understanding of provenance to understand the larger context of creation and use, which is more complicated than just thinking about the one individual or entity that created some sort of record. Bastian, for example, expands provenance to place and community. But such a framework could be reimagined for a community bounded not by a shared geography, but by a specific intellectual context or milieu. Postmodern conceptions of records have rendered archives as contingent and situated in understanding provenance that reframe its boundaries as more mutable and a little bit more blurry, I should add. In their discussion of digital projects and websites, again, Emily Monks-Leeson, who I mentioned earlier, sees this reconfiguration of provenance as leading to, quote, a renewed interest in ways of representing records' context of creation and use to reveal complex and shifting meanings without abandoning a foundation from which such meanings can be gleaned. Despite this broadening of our understandings of provenance, digital scholarship projects still require archival context in the form of metadata that preserves information about the original archives and provenance, especially if such projects can lead to confusion about that original context. At the same time, being able to create access to materials through a more fluid network speaks to discussions about access in the digital age that seeks to look at alternatives to hierarchical aggregations in favor of user-driven reorderings of material. Jeffrey Yao articulates a vision in an article that he published in Archivaria titled "Bringing Things Together, Aggregate Records in a Digital Age." And he writes that, quote, "Instead of preordaining the groupings our users will encounter, we can employ technologies that make it easy to organize materials into multiple collections that reflect users' individual interests." Victoria Lemieux similarly explores this possibility in the construction of dynamic archival interfaces that represent and visualize records through a systems or network-based model. And if you're interested in reading more about that, she also published an article in Archivaria titled "Toward a Third Order Archival Interface" that is definitely worth reading. Notions about dynamic interfaces speak to the recognition that records are created in complex environments and the result of a complex set of relationships. Being able to visualize and understand these relationships respects the complexity of archives, more broadly speaking. I argue that such approaches are particularly important to consider when creating access to scientific archives and for a transdiscipline like cybernetics to help represent or respect the complex set of relationships sort of represented by this idea of the thought collective that generated these ideas, core concepts, and the records that document their development. So if you're interested in finding out more about this project, there's several links here on this slide, and I can, again, I can put these in the chat if that would be useful, or I don't know if these slides can be made available later on. But there's a link to the sort of prototype portal that we created. Again, the digital collection where all of the metadata and the data that's available as a CSV file can be downloaded. Our GitHub repository, and also the white paper that we published on the project at its end. A recent article that I published on this project. And then you're also welcome to email me if you have any questions or thoughts. I would certainly appreciate hearing from you and learning your thoughts about this. And then I can also see if I can make this list of resources available later on to be shared with all attendees. But this is a list of some readings and projects about digital scholarship or computational approaches to archives that I have found really useful in my own research. And but I would also love to hear from the attendees, if there's any readings that you've come across or projects you've come across that are really interesting in this area. And thank you. I really appreciate the time and the opportunity to share this work with you. And I would love to hear any questions or thoughts, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Sure. We have many questions. Thank you so much, Bethany, and I'm really having really fun and stimulated by the idea that you raised during your presentation. So first of all, I would like to thank you, Professor Bethany, for this informative and interesting webinar, as we used to have from you. And because I know that you have other engagements, so I will go directly to the question we received, because there is a huge number of questions comes there. I tried my best to classify them and then try to immerse some of them together. The first one will take us to the initial slides, as it's asked for more differentiation between the digital scholarship and digital humanities. So will you elaborate more about these two terms, please?
Yes, and if anybody else has better definitions than I do, please share as well. But my understanding is that digital humanities is more of an academic field. So there's many people who argue that digital humanities is sort of on the same level as like English or anthropology. It's it has, a number of different methods and conversations that are built into it that sort of raises it to this larger scholarly kind of level, so to speak. Whereas digital scholarship is more, it's more kind of methodology based, I would say. It's more like this is an approach to working with digital tools, digital materials, digital archives, digital or data. And I think one thing that's important to note, though, is that digital humanities, by its title, is very focused on the humanities, whereas I think digital scholarship is a bit broader in that it can be applied to data or digital projects in any discipline. So you could have a digital scholarship project in the social sciences, for example. So I don't know if that helps clarify, but yeah, certainly if anybody else has input or better definitions than me, please do share.
I think the operational definition will be the gateway to understand it more than the classical or standard definition, especially that we have from Mr. Ismail Osman, similar question, the difference between the digital archives and cloud computing. I think he's going far a little bit about the definition, but let's try to have a clear, short clarification for the digital archives and the linking to the cloud computing.
That's a really good question. Thank you. I will preface this by saying that I think different disciplines probably have different definitions of digital archives or archives more specifically. For example, yes. Computer science has a different definition than the archival profession has. But I will say that I think digital archives, from my point of view, includes born digital material and digitized material. So this could include, let's say on your own computer, you have probably a variety of documents that you've saved in various folders or maybe on your desktop. So this would be born digital because it's created digitally in its origin. Whereas digitized material is, let's say you have a paper document and then you scan this and then you create a digital surrogate. So from my perspective, digital archives would include kind of both of those types of records. And the other question was cloud computing, is that correct?
Yep.
Cloud computing, I don't know that I have a good definition for that.
It's fine. The practicing of the thing that is the most easiest way to understand the concept. So even that we can set up many definition for things, we still need just to practice it, just to know the slightly difference between these very close terms. Okay, yeah. So we have another question here. It's the example of digital scholarship projects you presented were very impressive and outstanding. But how about the cost of executing such projects, or even build a small digital humanities or digital archive lab, since most of the libraries and knowledge center are suffering from budget issues? I think it's a good one.
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you for that. I'm really glad you raised that point. We would not have been able to do this project without grant funding because we simply don't have the time and resources in our own archives to do that kind of work. So that raises an interesting point about the labor that you need to support this kind of work. And I know there have been a lot of technological advances since we did this project, which was back in 2017 and we ended in 2019. So if there are, software that can more easily do this work, that's great and that might help, but I think that it's, it would be unwise to assume that you still wouldn't need to devote time and resources to it and funds. And one thing I think is also really important is that, because a lot of the natural language processing and machine learning tools are developed by the information technology community, they're not necessarily developed with archivists in mind or libraries in mind. And so I think that requires extra consideration to think about how to use them in that way. So yeah, thank you for that question. That's a really good point.
Perfect. Okay, the next question is about digitization and OCR still facing some problems in specific language like Arabic, for example. What is your reflection on this issue?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not familiar with digitizing content in languages other than English and then also some European languages, because some of the cybernetics materials that we worked with were in Italian, German, French, and so forth. But I haven't had experience with Arabic. I don't know offhand if there are OCR tools that can accommodate different scripts and characters. I would hope that the technology community puts efforts into developing that, because I think that's really important to be able to do. But from my own experience with OCR, I know that because archival materials, and I don't know about the materials that the individual who asked the question is working with, but archival materials may present text in a way that the OCR may not easily recognize. So one of the things we had to clean up was all these words that got mushed together, so to speak, or
yes.
Where it looked at some typed text and it thought, it didn't realize it was one word, and so there was all these spaces in between the letters. And so it was very time consuming to clean that up. I don't know if this is if this tool can be used for Arabic specifically, but in the UK, the United Kingdom, there's a tool being developed called Transcribus, which I know that they're developing more kind of advanced algorithms to deal with transcribing text, and so I don't know if something like that might be useful. But yeah, if not, maybe the Transcribus team would appreciate knowing that it's helpful to use tools like this in different languages and not just English or European languages specifically. So yeah, so I hope that helps, and good luck with your project and the materials that you're working with. I'd be happy to talk offline if you'd like to chat further as well.
Perfect. Thank you, because I totally agree with you, especially this type of program, and also for the processes that will understand and consider the special specification and characteristic of the languages. I think it will help a lot for this one. Especially we have here Mr. Sami Medid touch the same part by saying that with the use of artificial intelligence solve the problem of Arabic characters detection, and I wonder if there is a project on this or not. So I think he already talking about the same things. I think Japanese, Arabic, and Chinese need special manipulation or dealing with the characters. The next question, quickly, that comes here from Ms. Amani. She said that, can we consider digital archives as a newly tool for collecting, organizing ideas and knowledge, as well as brainstorming mechanism?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Let me see if I can put this in the chat, but there's two articles that I mentioned that I think would speak to that question really well. One is from Jeffrey Yao, and I do apologize, these articles are in English. So Jeffrey Yao's article where he talks about, yeah, essentially how digital archives kind of open up new explorations of arranging and engaging with archives kind of more broadly. And then an article by Victoria Lemieux, I think is also speaks to that question. That's the chat. Those should be the full citations. And I believe both of those articles are open access. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and we'll see where this goes. It'll be really interesting to see how new technologies allow us to explore these interesting questions about digital archives.
Perfect, and especially I think many of the attendees just mentioning that there is some applications just help in OCR for Arabic and other non-Romanian language. Okay, so we have another question here. This is in Arabic. It's the summary of it is just saying that, do we need the archives and the archival program forever or for permanent time, or this is a temporary, especially that now we are moving to the digital archives or digital documents, digital files and so on, or this will stay for the rest of the time as it's holding the history of the organization. You know, this, what we call it, not contradiction, but at least this thinking about the archive and the historical documents comparing with the records that we use it in a daily basis.
Yeah.
So what's your expectation for the future, Bethany?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think we still need physical archives and archives as places. I think those are important. I don't think, at least from my own experience, people are still creating paper records. I think that if you just digitize everything and make it available online, I think that's great, and that helps in a sense democratize access to archives, but there's something lost when you can't see the physical record in front of you. I think that's important. I also think coming into an archives as a space, whether it's a building or wherever the institution might be, it's an important experience to have, because archives, well, let me say real quickly that I tend to not use the word archive without an S. I always use archives with an S, because I always see it as being plural, because records in an institution have relationships to each other. So in the university archives where I work, we have records from different units, departments on campus, papers of faculty members, alumni papers. They're all related in some way, shape, or form. And I think you realize that when you're in the space of an archives. So I don't think we should discount that. However, I do want to say that I think digitizing materials can be a very important thing to do. There are things like natural disasters, war, conflicts, things that, can impact, archives in some way, shape, or form, whether there's like a flood or something gets destroyed in a bombing. And so actually I have a colleague of mine here at the University of Illinois named Laila Hussein Mustafa. She has written quite a bit about how archives should, try to take measures to, digitize or try to preserve materials that could be in danger. So I think, digitizing content is one way to do that. I think it's also important to have a plan, to try to save those materials. But yeah, so I think it's important to balance those things, to still think about the importance of having an archives as a place, and then also trying to think about the long-term safety of materials, of archival materials. So I don't know if that answers the question.
No. I totally agree with you, especially if we're talking about the official document that, like the birth certificate, the thing that you need, the manuscripts, for example. So you need the original physical one as so far. Okay. We have question here. So you mentioned Professor Bethany after hijab. Thank you so much about this presentation. He said that you mentioned that the term digital age many times in your presentation. Do you think the characteristics of the age, the digital age, is the same between the developed countries and the developed countries? I think it's a good one.
Just to make sure I understood the question correctly. So I apologize.
Of the digital age, is it the same if we're talking about this digital age in the developed countries comparing with the developing countries?
Yes, that's a good point.
One. I like very smart one. It's a smart one. Yes.
Yes, it is. Yes, thank you for raising that question. Yeah, I don't think it is at all. That's a really good point that I think you're raising, which is that, yeah, there's a digital divide. I think it's important to recognize that. You know, this is also why we still need to have physical archives too, paper archives, because yeah, that's an important way to you know, still be able to look at your history and have government transparency and things like that. So you still need the physical component. So yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that. And I think sometimes I get wrapped up and I think everything's a digital age, but it's not the same everywhere. So I appreciate your point. Thank you.
I also agree with you about this, especially we are not talking about only technology. There is a culture, there is the human reflection, and there is other aspects that should be considered in the whole formula. Okay, yes. There is another question related to how do we deal with the inflation of documents on a daily basis in the government institutions, and also there's other question I think related is how we can archive the big data that increased day by day. So can you just answer them together, please?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for those questions. I think that you know, it's going to depend upon the what sort of laws and records, I should say records laws are in place in your individual context, you know, that will determine, like, you know, in many cases, what records you have to keep and what you might be able to retain for a period of time and potentially dispose if it doesn't have long-term historical value or some other administrative value, I should say. So I think, you know, that's a place to start. I do think it's important to, and this is very hard to do as an archivist. This is probably one of the hardest aspects of my job, is determining what has value and what to keep and what not to keep. And I think one thing that's helped me, hasn't solved my problem by any means, but one thing that has helped me is to talk as much as possible to the individual or people who are creating these records to find out more about them, which I think can help inform decisions then about, like, what to keep and what not to keep. And I think that's, you know, helpful to do whether you're working with paper records or analog material or digital records, digital archives, I should say. So I think that's one thing. The other thing, you mentioned big data, and I think we're absolutely dealing with big data. We've been dealing with big data also in the paper world, not just in the digital world, I think, for quite a long time. But you know, with big data in a digital form, you know, I do think looking for using some of these tools that the archival community is experimenting with might be one place to start, you know, or using tools to gather as much information about your records as possible. So if you can use some sort of software program to, like, give you some sort of metadata or just information about it, you know, even as basic as what are the dates of all these materials, how many file formats do you have, What is the overall extent? Things like this. I think, just having some basic information can be a starting place. It may not solve all the problems of trying to figure out how to make that decision about what to keep, but that might be one place to start. And there is an article, if you'll bear with me just a minute, that I'll put in the chat that was written by some colleagues from Australia who were using artificial intelligence tools to look at how to identify confidential and sensitive content in digital materials. And the last name is Roland, and so let me just take a quick look for this. Sorry, my notes. I will have to track that down, but yeah, so I think looking at other case studies that are coming out of the archival community who are grappling with these same questions can be a useful way to approach this. So I hope that helps answer your question, and I'll find that article and I'll put it in the chat.
That's fine. Thank you. You can send it later on through the email and we can share it with the attendees. I know that the time is running very fast, so let's take 2 more questions. The first one is about, would you just give us some applications for cybernetics in library field? This is the first one, and the last one I will tell you after you just answer this one. Okay. Some application for cybernetics in the library field and library and archives field.
Yeah, that's a good question. And sorry, I just want to say quickly, I put the citation in the chat for the article we just mentioned. Might be one place to start at least. There's other articles out there. But yeah, to the question about the application of cybernetics to archives, that's an interesting question. I will say there is an article, and I apologize, I think in terms of what my other colleagues are writing a lot, so forgive me for drawing on their work here. But there's a colleague, Jenny Bunn, who I believe works at the UK National Archives. And she wrote an article on using cybernetics to archival description. And the article was published in Archival Science. And I can share that with you later, and if you want to email that to the attendees. I think it's a really interesting article, like looking at yeah, just basically how you can use the ideas of cybernetics and feedback, which is a core component of cybernetics, to describe archives. So that's one example that I know out there. In my own project, I like to think that maybe we were using cybernetic methods on the archives of cybernetics, which is sort of a very meta project, if you will. But yeah, I think cybernetics is a fascinating field of study, and it has a lot of lessons for all kinds of disciplines, and it's definitely worth looking into.
Thank you so much. But bottom the line, just I think your colleagues is very lucky of you, because you can recall all of them, just or the write-ups that they did, or the articles. So they are so lucky because they having you, that you can recall this for thing and promoting, by the way. Our last question is, it's about your reflection, your expectation for the future of the scholarship, the digital scholarship. So what's your expectation for this one? And this is the last question that we can have it, just to stick to our time, to give you the time just to move to your engagement. And also we apologize for the rest of the questions that we have, but we are welcoming to receive it in the through the email to share it with you. Again, the last question will be about your expectation for the future of the digital scholarship, please.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think after having discussed all of the merits of digital scholarship and digital tools, I think I think that it's important to emphasize that it's not a solution. Especially after having gone through this project that I described, I don't think that these tools can replace the archivist or the sort of
human factor.
Yes. So the archivist and how we steward materials, I think that we're going to continue to need archival perspectives on this. And in other words, I don't think we can be replaced by robots. So yes. So yeah, but I do think that there's a lot of interesting things you can do with these kinds of tools and with digital scholarship. So I think it's worth exploring to see where this leads you. But yeah, I still think it's important to realize that our voices and perspectives are needed when we work with archives, and that it's important not to lose that. So I think that's my reflection.
Yes, and I think this is an awesome wrapping up and the recap for this webinar. It was amazing closing up, and for sure that we do appreciate your knowledge, your sharing of these projects and case studies, and also your experience. Appreciated, Bethany, so much your presence with us, and we are looking for another round and another engagement from your side to our. I know that you have a very busy schedule, but we're still catching the hope to see you again and to have another topic to sharing us your reflection about it. Thank you so much. Thank you for the attendees. And again, we are honored to have you. And again, we thank Medad for sponsoring these webinars. And I will let you leave you for the last word here. Please go ahead, Bethany.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was an honor to be here and to present this webinar. So thank you again. I really appreciate all the questions and engagement.
Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day for you. Have a wonderful night on our side.